For nearly a decade, everyone assumed the same thing about the 2026 FIFA World Cup. The United States would be the star. Canada and Mexico would be supporting characters. That was the plan. That was the expectation. And honestly, it made perfect sense. The United States had the biggest stadiums, the biggest sponsorship deals, the biggest television market, the biggest commercial machine in world football. When FIFA awarded the tournament to all three nations back in 2018, most people saw it as America's World Cup, with a little help from its neighbors. But something unexpected has happened. As the tournament gets closer, the conversation has started changing. Not because the United States failed. The stadiums are incredible. The infrastructure is world-class. The money is there. The attention is there. But while America focused on building the biggest World Cup ever, Canada and Mexico focused on building something else, an experience, an atmosphere, a connection. And in the process, they may have captured something that money can't buy, the emotional heart of the tournament. Because when fans talk about the 2026 World Cup right now, many aren't talking about giant stadiums or billion-dollar sponsorships. They're talking about Mexico City. They're talking about Toronto. They're talking about football culture, passion, identity, and what the World Cup is supposed to feel like. Which raises a fascinating question. What if the most important story of World Cup 2026 isn't who wins the trophy, but which country truly wins the fans? Because once you look closely at what's happening behind the scenes, the answer might surprise you. Let's investigate. The biggest misconception about hosting a World Cup is believing it's only about stadiums. It isn't. Anyone can build a stadium. Not everyone can create an atmosphere. And that's where this story starts. Because if you compare the three host nations, something interesting becomes obvious. They are trying to win in completely different ways. The United States is trying to host the biggest World Cup. Mexico is trying to host the most passionate World Cup. And Canada is trying to host the most welcoming World Cup. Three different strategies, three different identities, three different visions of what football should look like. Let's start with Mexico, because no country involved in this tournament understands World Cup history better. This isn't Mexico's first World Cup. It's not their second. It's not even their third. Mexico has been living and breathing World Cup football for generations. For many Mexican supporters, football isn't entertainment. It's culture, family, and identity. It's something passed down from parents to children, grandparents to grandchildren. That's why the atmosphere feels different. You don't need marketing campaigns to convince people to care. They already care. The World Cup doesn't arrive in Mexico and create excitement. The excitement already exists. The tournament simply gives it a stage. That's a huge advantage because atmosphere can't be manufactured. You either have it or you don't. And Mexico has had it for decades. Then there's the Azteca, one of the most iconic football stadiums on earth. A stadium that has hosted legends, witnessed history, and that football fans around the world immediately recognize. When supporters imagine World Cup football in Mexico, they're not imagining a corporate event. They're imagining noise, color, passion, and chaos. The kind of environment that makes television viewers wish they were there. That's powerful, very powerful. Now let's move north, because Canada's rise is arguably even more surprising. For years, Canada wasn't considered a football nation. Hockey dominated the conversation. Football existed, but it wasn't central to the country's sporting identity. Then something changed. An entire generation arrived. Alphonso Davies, Jonathan David, Stephen Eustachio, and Kyle Larin. Players who proved Canada could compete internationally. Players who gave supporters something they hadn't experienced before. Belief. Suddenly, football wasn't a niche sport anymore. It was becoming part of the national conversation. And now Canada enters the World Cup with something unique. Momentum. The country feels like a football nation that's still discovering how good it can become. There's excitement, curiosity, and energy. The feeling that supporters are witnessing the beginning of something. That kind of emotion is difficult to replicate because it feels authentic. And authenticity matters, especially during major tournaments. Now, compare that with the United States. America has advantages neither Canada nor Mexico can match. The largest sports market, the largest media market, some of the most advanced stadiums ever built. Extraordinary infrastructure, extraordinary resources, and extraordinary commercial power. On paper, America should dominate this conversation, and yet many football fans feel strangely disconnected from the tournament. Why? Because football culture doesn't automatically appear just because a stadium exists. Football culture is built over time. It's built through memories, traditions, and generations of supporters. And while football has grown dramatically in the United States, it's still competing against something no other host nation faces: the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, college football, and college basketball. The American sports landscape is already crowded, very crowded, which means the World Cup has to fight for attention in a way it doesn't in Mexico and doesn't in Canada. That's not a criticism, it's simply reality. The United States isn't trying to become a football nation. It's trying to become one of several major sports nations simultaneously. That creates a different atmosphere, a different relationship with the game, and a different challenge. The irony is that FIFA probably needed all three countries, because each one solves a different problem. America provides scale, Mexico provides passion, Canada provides accessibility. Together, they create something no single nation could create alone. But here's where things become really interesting. Because tournaments aren't remembered for infrastructure. Nobody talks about parking lots 20 years later. Nobody talks about sponsorship agreements. Nobody remembers logistics. People remember emotions, moments, and atmospheres. Think about the greatest World Cups ever played. What do fans remember? The crowds, the celebrations, the noise, and the feeling. Not the business side, the human side. And that's why Canada and Mexico have become such an important part of this story, because many supporters increasingly feel that those countries represent the emotional core of the tournament. The places where football feels natural, the places where football feels personal, the places where football feels alive. That doesn't mean America is failing. Far from it. The United States will host the biggest matches, the knockout rounds, the semifinals, and the final. Many of the tournament's defining moments will happen on American soil. But hosting the biggest matches and owning the tournament's identity are not always the same thing. Sometimes the emotional center of a tournament emerges somewhere else entirely, and that's exactly what may be happening here. Because while America remains the tournament's economic powerhouse, Canada and Mexico are quietly becoming something equally important: the soul of the story. And if that trend continues once the football begins, the narrative surrounding this World Cup could change dramatically. Because suddenly the question won't be who hosted the most matches. The question will be who created the most unforgettable experience. And those are two very different competitions. And that's what makes this World Cup so fascinating. Because for the first time in modern FIFA World Cup history, we aren't really talking about one host nation. We're talking about three completely different football stories unfolding at the same time. The United States represents football's future growth. Mexico represents football's history. Canada represents football's emerging future. And somewhere between those three identities, the 2026 World Cup will find its personality. But here's the part most people are missing. When the final whistle blows in July, nobody will care how many press conferences were held. Nobody will care how many sponsorship deals were signed. Nobody will care how much revenue was generated. Fans will remember something much simpler: how the tournament felt. That's it. That's the real scoreboard. Because the greatest World Cups are remembered emotionally. People still talk about Brazil 2014, not because of infrastructure, but because of the atmosphere. People still talk about South Africa 2010, not because of financial reports, but because of the feeling, the noise, the energy, the memories. And that's why Canada and Mexico have become such important players in this story. They've reminded everyone what supporters actually care about: community, identity, passion, belonging. The things that cannot be purchased, the things that cannot be manufactured, the things that make football different from every other sport on earth. Of course, the United States still holds enormous advantages: the biggest stadiums, the biggest television audiences, the biggest commercial opportunities. Many of the tournament's most iconic moments will happen on American soil: the semifinals, the final, and the trophy lift. The images that will be replayed for decades. But here's the challenge. Having the biggest stage doesn't automatically make you the center of the story. You still have to capture the imagination of the audience. And right now, Canada and Mexico are doing exactly that. Not because they have more money, and not because they have bigger stadiums, but because they are delivering something supporters instantly recognize. Authenticity. The kind of authenticity that football fans can feel immediately. And if that continues once the tournament begins, we could witness something remarkable. A World Cup where the biggest host nation doesn't completely dominate the narrative. A World Cup where atmosphere matters as much as infrastructure. A World Cup where passion competes with scale and maybe even beats it. Because ultimately, football has always belonged to the people who care about it most. Not the organizations, not the sponsors, not the executives. The supporters, the families, the communities. The people who build their lives around the game. And if World Cup 2026 teaches us anything, it may be this. The biggest host isn't always the most important host. Sometimes the countries that leave the deepest impression are the ones that make football feel like home. And that's exactly why Canada and Mexico are becoming two of the most important stories of the entire tournament. The football hasn't even started yet, and they're already winning hearts. So now that you know why Canada and Mexico are gaining ground ahead of the 2026 FIFA World Cup, you're ready for the next level. Click the video on your screen right now to find out why many football experts believe World Cup 2026 could completely transform the future of FIFA forever.